As was mentioned, I'm on a book tour right now, and it's been really interesting. I've been doing the West Coast predominantly for this month, and I've been traveling all across, meeting people from different places, and just listening to their questions. My background is in microbiology and genetics, and then public policy, and then I went to work as a pastry chef. I don't use any of that anymore. But one of the most interesting things that's happened on this book tour is that this is after the pandemic. So people are coming out, they're very excited, and they bring their questions. And one of the questions that I get predominantly is, and they kind of both relate to each other, are you an Indian cookbook author? Which is yes, I am of Indian origin. Are your cookbooks about Indian food? They're not. And do you cook Indian recipes? And again, I say sometimes, maybe, but I feel like there's a deeper point there that I'm not really going to get into. But what I'm trying to make a point here is association. And I think one of the things that happens, having worked in food media and food writing and cooking, I feel there are a lot of perceptions that constantly keep coming up that we're associating with flavor. And also, this sets the tone and the stage as to who is able to tell the story of cooking, be it on TV, media, magazines, and elsewhere. And that's important because that is setting the stage and the tone for what we're presenting to the world. Okay, this slide. Okay, I should probably explain what this slide is about. So it's just basically a bunch of things that kind of represent flavor to me, and flavor means so many different things to people. So flavor by itself is a really complicated topic to write about and also define. And this is something that I learned when I was writing my second cookbook, which is called The Flavor Equation. I struggled with defining flavor in a more concrete sense because it is impossible to do that. As cooks, we're always taught flavor is aroma and taste. Those are the two most important things. And if you look on the right, there is this brain map that I created for my book. I'm not quite sure how easy it is to read from up there. But what you really need to remember is that the human brain does not memorize taste. The only thing that the brain remembers is aroma. So when people think about a dish that they love or they hate, it's the memory of the aroma that's called back, but not taste. And aroma is so important in defining flavor for us. Think about if you eat a dish and you close your nose really tight, it's going to taste flat. It's not going to be fun. So aroma is a really important concept in flavor. Now, the next senses that are involved in flavor are texture, sight, sound, and emotions and memory. And a large part of my conversation today is going to focus on emotions and memory. Texture. So texture is how food feels, the sense of touch. And that's so important because not only is it important because it helps create sounds sometimes. If you're eating something crunchy like potato chips, it creates sounds in the mouth. Your food is more exciting, more palatable. It's an important ploy for marketing people. And think about potato chips. Potato chips are crunchy. The ruffled textures. It's all created and engineered. Food engineers design these things so that you can appreciate the taste of salt more. You get a better appreciation for the sweetness of the starch in the potatoes as it breaks down in your mouth. Sight. Sight is something that's so important, especially right now because we're constantly bombarded by Instagram, TikTok, right? And you're looking at food magazines, TV shows. We're constantly being primed by visuals on what food should look like, what it should taste like. So sight's a really important thing that we can't really get away from. And then sound. Think about, I'm going to go back to potato chips. Think about when you open a bag of potato chips, that sound that it makes. That bag has been engineered by food engineers and product engineers to create a sound that makes the food more appealing. So every action that you're taking, especially when it comes to commercial food, every action is designed to enhance your consumption of that food. One of the things I did when I was writing The Flavor Equation, I love polling people, and I interviewed a bunch of people that had lost their sense or weren't born with one of those senses. So I spoke to people who were either blind or deaf and asked them how did they approach cooking and how did they feel about eating at restaurants, the responses were really interesting. They start to rely on senses that they have much more. There was a person that I spoke to who was blind, and he told me when he's in the kitchen, there are two things that he loves. He loves artificial intelligence tools like Siri and Google and Alexa because they can tell him what to do in the kitchen. The other thing that he told me about fascinated me. He said, I don't need to touch the faucet when water is warm or cold. I can tell it by the sound that it makes when it hits the sink. And that makes sense because the density of water changes with temperature, but as someone who has all his senses, I've never paid attention to that. So it's just fascinating, even from a sensory approach, to see how people who lack these senses approach cooking and also consuming food. Emotions and memory. This is one of the most fascinating things for me because I studied public policy, and I also used to, when I was at Georgetown at the Department of Medicine, one of the things, one of my projects was to study how people responded to different diets. And human behavior is a fascinating, complex thing. You can never control people. They'll never do what you tell them to do. Now, if you look at this figure, just focus on the first half. So the first half is based on an experiment that was done in Oxford at the Cross-Modal Research Center. And what they did was they were trying to understand if food had an effect on the perception of taste. And what they did was, in the first experiment, which is on top, they had two teams of people, or rather two groups of people. Both of them had sports teams that were playing that day. Okay? They were given the same foods to eat separately. The team that lost, those people reported tasting the food as sour because they were sad. The other group whose team won, they were really happy, and they reported their food as tasting sweeter. So you can just see how emotions affect our sense of taste. Now, in the second experiment, they decided to do something very different. And this is fascinating because our sense of taste can also affect our sense of, sorry, my lips are getting dry. Taste can affect our sense of emotion and memory. So what was done in a courtroom, they found that when the jury was given a sweet drink or a sour drink, people who drank the sour drink voted much more favorably than those who drank the sour drink. So what you're eating also influences the decisions you make, which is fascinating. So like I said, I love polling people all the time. Even if you don't know it, I'm probably polling you right now and paying attention to what you're doing. I wanted to ask people, so I ran this experiment, and I asked people, tell me the first thing that comes to your mind if I give you a taste and color or shape. This is really fascinating because it really points to what we're constantly seeing in media and marketing all the time. Now, with color, people reported savory as brown because they thought of meat. That's the first color that came up. With hot, chilies. People think of chilies, and paprika was an example that was brought up earlier. Sweet, people think of brown sugar, honey, maple syrup. With fat, a lot of them, I thought fat would be yellow, but a lot of people thought of just clear grapeseed oil, which I've always thought was a little yellowish, but. And then with sour, everyone used lemon as an example. Now, lemons are probably the most used example for acid in cookbooks, on TV shows, in ads, so it's not surprising that people thought of this. With shapes and taste, it started to become a little more difficult to parse. Salty, and so people reported salt as one of the triangular shapes, and the reason for that is because they associated the sharp crystal edges. And sweet. Sweet was the other one that kind of made sense because people said they were thinking of drops of fruit juices or honey, maple syrup. So we're constantly being impinged by what we see, and that creates association. So again, when in this talk, think about people that don't have their senses and also how this plays out into the associations we constantly make with flavor and culture. Now, if you look at these 5 food photographs, can anyone tell me what's common to all of them? should have drank water. They're all fermentation products. So the first is a slide that I took at UC Berkeley on yeast extract. The second one is chocolate. Chocolate's fermented. Yogurt, vinegar, obvious examples. The last slide up there is lab synthesized meat. And lab synthesized meat, I put this up here because we're talking about new foods coming into existence. Lab synthesized meat is probably one of the most talked about things right now. There was an article recently in the San Francisco Chronicle about chicken at Dominique Cren's restaurant. That's lab synthesized. So I think it's really important that depending on how we positively or negatively make associations with lab synthesized meat, this is going to be a key player, or rather a big thing that's going to come up in the next couple of years constantly. And one of the reasons why sales have been so low is because people aren't willing to make that mental jump to think about lab synthesized meat as something that's fun, kind of like those ads where Chipotle did that campaign to show, beautiful green farms and all that stuff. I think that's a cultural perception thing that's happening here. So, like I said earlier, flavor is one of those really difficult things to define. And what if we change the conversation a little bit? What if we define it in much more broader terms as something that's a combination of culture and tradition? Also with the science stuff, because to me, I feel science is something that goes hand in hand with all of these elements. They're inseparable. A lot of the science that we're using today, like fermentation, for example, this is something that our ancestors have been doing for centuries without having all those little tools that we have in labs. And it's fascinating, through trial and error, they were able to develop different methods that we still use today. So why is flavor important? Flavor is important because it helps us appreciate food. Without appreciating food, we probably wouldn't be getting the nutrients that we need. With patients, it's really important to I like to say that you're seducing them to eat more food. But flavor is really important because without flavor, you will never get an understanding of why you need to eat. Flavor. Okay, so I came to America. I lived in Cincinnati at the time, and I hadn't seen the world. America was the first country outside India that I had lived in at the time. And for me, food was a way to experience the world. It was my passport to the world to experience different cultures, different ingredients. And even coming from India, people say, oh my gosh, all these spices, blah, blah, blah. I had never really tasted real oregano in India. And I also learned that pizza sauce is not made with ketchup. At the time, that was something that was done in India. So for me, it was really fascinating just to use food as something to open up the world to me. And one of the things I learned in public policy school was, in a very, very fascinating way, policy decisions can be influenced by flavor. Think about the taxes that are applied on sugary drinks, right? The government constantly increases the tax so people consume less sugar. In hospitals, this is kind of like a segue from that, but in hospitals, one of the things we used to do in order to teach patients, or rather ask people to consume a liquid diet and to load them with water, we would give them artificial sweeteners. So you don't increase the calorie intake, the total caloric intake, but they get water loaded. And it is fascinating just how flavor plays such an important role everywhere, constantly. How are we experiencing flavor today? So a lot of that has changed. Digital consumption, I feel I'm constantly on my cell phone, either looking at Instagram. I don't look at TikTok too much, it's a different age group. But I feel we're consuming food digitally more so than ever right now. So like I mentioned, the social media apps, but also restaurant delivery apps. When I lived in San Francisco, I was working as a food photographer for a food delivery startup company where the chefs would cook meals. And I was responsible for styling and photographing the food. Now, the food engineers were so smart, they would use the photos and measure how long men and women spent looking at those dishes, whether spending that much time on them actually converted to a sale. They also looked at socioeconomic status to look at which regions, where what was going, and then those particular dishes would be shown to people to purchase. So the amount of data that is mined from food visuals is insane. Consumers these days also want to experience flavor, but they also want to feel connected to the story. Narratives have become so important right now. And often without a story or telling people why you're doing something, it's kind of useless. One of my friends, Chef Azma Khan, who runs Darjeeling London, she does a fascinating job with her staff as well as with her. When you go there, you're explained about every component of the meal. There is a little story to it. And I think a large part of her success is just because of the storytelling. She's an amazing storyteller. And I think people are also just so curious and interested in diversity of flavor. Where are ingredients coming from? Why are you using it here? And why is another culture using it somewhere else? My mother comes from a Portuguese colony in India called Goa. And chorizo is a big part of our culture. And I often get the question is, why are you using chorizo in your food? It's a part of my culture. So, those are the kind of questions where you see repeated elements all across the globe. It's just fascinating diving into those things to understand it more. Another thing that's really important right now is also where our ingredients are coming from. What is the sustainability impact? How are the producers being compensated? Is it all equitable? Flavor pairings. I'm not a big believer, and you guys are going to hate me for saying this, I'm not a big believer in algorithms for determining flavor pairings. The reason is an algorithm is tuned to feed biases. And with biases, what happens is it's going to push you in the direction that you want to go. So over time, I feel it really doesn't give you the chance to really experiment and break the rules. That's important. Flavor is also important because you can use it to create holistic approaches to cooking, which is so important right now. Mental and physical well-being is important. You can also use flavor, like I mentioned earlier, to cater to special diets for people that are delicious, but also, feed whatever kind of requirements that they need. And it is really important to use this information to educate, inform research, and develop better recipes. My job is to teach people how to cook at home. And one of the things I try to do when I create recipes for my books or for my columns that I've written, it's always about mentally breaking it down. And so the way I create recipes is as flowcharts, because I come from a science background. And this was something that I did for my cookbook, The Flavor Equation, to show people how I develop recipes. So I think of recipes in terms of those 5 different components of flavor that I mentioned earlier, but also at what stages, which chemical reactions are taking place to produce food. Now this particular recipe focuses on emotion and happiness. But I'll show you another slide where I've stripped away that. And this is more of a solid chemistry experiment where you're using dried shiitake mushrooms, you're soaking them at the right temperature to let the enzymes do their thing and create all that extra umami. But this is stripped of those emotions and memories. So it just shows you how 2 different approaches to cooking something can evolve, and they're all good. One, and probably the most difficult thing, is to pay attention to trends and watch for future trends. I use Google. Google kind of gives me a sense of what to expect in the future, but I feel this is something that's very impossible to pin down. Also, the goal, and this is something that I was taught early on in food writing, the goal of a restaurant critic or a food writer is to push people in a direction, to teach them how to appreciate new flavors and ingredients, but also use them. And one of the things I've tried to do in my writing is to apply science to make it easier for people to cook at home. I think traditions are important, but I think it is also important to remember that traditions are meant to be broken. It's okay to step away as long as you know what you're doing and you give an appreciation to the culture where it came from. I think that's absolutely fine. Like, I don't cook Indian food. I really don't cook a lot of Indian food, and that's fine. And for me, something that I like to do is also combine science with tradition constantly, like I said earlier, to make cooking easier and better. 38 seconds. Thank you.